Willow Acres wasn't just a plot of land to me. It was home. It was where I spent summers fishing in the winding creek under the ancient oak trees and winters watching deer meander through the snow-laced meadow. It belonged to my grandfather before me, who always said, "The land is only as good as the stories it keeps, and boy, this place has tales to tell." Those words echoed louder now than they had in years. I didn't ask for trouble. Trouble came to me in the form of Karen Colbert and her insufferable HOA. She was a walking cliché of suburban tyranny, decked out in pastel-colored blouses and pearls, wielding a clipboard like a sword. Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was an institution in Briar Glen, her iron will propped up by a gaggle of sycophantic board members whose primary joy in life seemed to be issuing petty fines and enforcing arbitrary rules. I first noticed something was off with Karen's sudden interest in my land one late summer evening. Sitting on my porch, sipping lemonade, I saw a group of people wandering Willow Acres with clipboards and cameras. They stumbled around scratching notes as if inspecting prize cattle. When I called out with a polite, "Can I help you?" one of them mumbled something about prospective development and shuffled off toward the fence line. By the next morning, I had my answer. A letter sat folded on my welcome mat, as pristine as if it had been hand-delivered by Karen herself. The shiny Briar Glen HOA logo stamped across the top made my stomach churn. We, the HOA of Briar Glen, are proud to announce plans for an expansion project that will benefit the entire community. Pending approval, Willow Acres will serve as the site for the prestigious Rosewood Heights development. I didn't bother reading the rest. Fuel boiled in my veins. My approval had never been sought. This was my land, Granddad's land, and now this HOA thought they could steal it with flowery language and legal end-arounds. I clenched the letter in my fist, but the fire in my chest cooled quickly. My anger wasn't going to win against Karen's machine. No, this fight would take patience, maneuvering. If I played my cards right, Karen and her HOA wouldn't just fail, they'd destroy themselves. That's when the plan began to unfold. Karen didn't waste time. Within weeks, the HOA voted unanimously to proceed with the project. Of course, by unanimously, I mean Karen likely badgered every last board member into voting in her favor. She began hosting town meetings to unveil her grand vision for Rosewood Heights, waving architectural plans like an artist showing off their masterpiece. Families oohed and ahed at the projected images of pastel-colored homes with wraparound porches and neatly trimmed hedges. They gawked at community playgrounds and artificial ponds carefully drawn into the plans. During one meeting at the community center, Karen stood behind the podium in a pastel blue blazer, flashing her pearly whites to the crowd. "We are building not just more houses," she declared with her trademark smugness, "but an elevated way of life. Rosewood Heights will redefine suburban living for Briar Glen." The applause was polite, obligatory. Not everyone was buying it, though. I caught Mike Addison, a local contractor Karen had hired, rolling his eyes from his spot near the back wall. Mike was no fan of Karen's micromanaging style, and his patience had begun to wear thin. I made a mental note of that. Still, Karen pressed forward with the project at lightning speed. Surveyors stomped through Willow Acres by early October. By November, bulldozers arrived, clawing at my granddad's once pristine meadow. It was rage-inducing, seeing the land reduced to rubble, but I held the anger inside. Karen couldn't know I was preparing the largest chess move of my life. The joke, of course, was that Karen didn't grasp the intricacies of property law or conservation ordinances. She didn't think she needed to. She saw herself as untouchable, as if her title in the HOA gave her dominion over everything within a 10-mile radius. And that arrogance, it would be her undoing. What Karen and her contractors didn't know was that Willow Acres wasn't some simple piece of farmland. My granddad had made sure of that. He was a clever, cautious man. Decades ago, he entered into agreements that preserved much of the land as a wildlife habitat, complete with ironclad restrictions that could bring the wrath of state and federal agencies down on anyone who tampered with it. I hired Mr. Hurley, the sharpest lawyer in 3 counties, to double-check every provision and loophole in those agreements. What we uncovered was beautiful. My land wasn't just protected under environmental law, it was riddled with arcane clauses and easements designed to keep developers tied up in legal red tape for years if they didn't cooperate with the title holder. And that, of course, was me. It was perfect, but to make the trap work, I had to be patient. I had to watch Willow Acres morph into Karen's vision of suburban perfection while staying quiet. I had to pretend I was beaten. During one of her inspections, Karen spotted me leaning on the fence line, sipping iced tea. She sauntered over, clipboard in hand, a too sweet smile stretched tight across her face. "Lovely weather today, isn't it?" she trilled. "It is," I agreed, feigning politeness. She glanced over her shoulder at the buzzing construction site. "The land is coming along nicely. You must feel so proud, knowing such an important project is happening here." "Oh, very proud," I said, barely containing my smirk. If only she knew. Rosewood Heights was shaping up fast. By spring, frames for the first 30 houses were complete. Karen hosted future resident tours every Saturday, guiding prospective buyers past the cookie-cutter homes like a real estate queen. The community newsletter branded the project as the pride of Briar Glen. Karen soaked in the accolades like a sponge, but cracks in her perfect world had already begun to form. For starters, not all residents of Briar Glen were thrilled about Rosewood Heights. The older families, who'd been around since before Karen transformed the HOA into her personal kingdom, grumbled about the project's scale. They didn't like the idea of muddy construction crews traipsing through their quiet streets, or the increase in traffic the development would bring. Others resented Karen's heavy-handed tactics, though most were too afraid to voice their displeasure outright. Then there were the contractors. Mike Addison, the head construction manager, became the unwitting canary in the coal mine. After months of dealing with Karen's constant interference, from her nagging emails about mailbox placements to her insistence that all front doors be painted eggshell white and nothing else, Mike snapped during a meeting. "I run sites," he bellowed, slamming his hard hat onto a table. "Not pageants." The board froze in stunned silence as Karen's jaw tightened. She didn't react in front of the others, but by the end of the week, Mike was off the project. It didn't go unnoticed by the other contractors. Meanwhile, I kept my ear to the ground and my trap well hidden. I made casual conversations with frustrated homeowners, encouraging their doubts with quiet, non-committal statements. "I'm sure Karen means well," I'd say with a shrug. "But, these big projects can get tricky." Little by little, the seeds of dissent took root. By the time summer rolled in, the air in Briar Glen felt charged with the kind of tension that settles before a storm. Karen's facade of total control was beginning to slip, and those cracks in her empire weren't just forming anymore, they were spreading fast. The first big blow came in June, when one of Karen's biggest champions on the HOA board, Helen Gates, quietly stepped down. No grand speeches, no public resignations. Just a short email circulated among the board stating she needed to focus on personal matters. But word on the street was that Helen had grown tired of Karen's heavy-handed leadership. There had been stories of Karen berating Helen during a meeting over something as small as needing more HOA pamphlets printed. Helen's resignation was quiet, but it sent ripples through the neighborhood. The timing couldn't have been worse for Karen. The State Environmental Commission was already conducting site inspections at Rosewood Heights, following my anonymous tip-off about the creek. I'd filed the complaint under a pseudonym, but the commission didn't care who sent it. What they did care about was the truckloads of dirt Karen's contractors had dumped near the water. That was their first red flag. The investigation slowed construction to a crawl, which only fueled Karen's stress and desperation. While she publicly assured everyone that a misunderstanding with some bureaucrats wouldn't stop the project, her actions told another story. She could barely walk through the neighborhood without her phone glued to her ear, arguing with lawyers, contractors, and anyone else who wasn't moving fast enough for her liking. Her frustration soon turned into an open campaign of intimidation. Karen began targeting anyone she suspected wasn't sufficiently loyal to her vision, starting with the growing faction of dissenters among Briarglen's homeowners. Take poor Mrs. Hargrove, for example. She was a sweet old woman whose hydrangeas had been a neighborhood staple for decades. But when she spoke up at a meeting about the disruption caused by the constant stream of construction trucks, Karen retaliated by issuing an HOA violation for her overgrown front yard. Overgrown. Those flowers were perfectly trimmed, but Karen knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't about the hydrangeas, it was about silencing Mrs. Hargrove and making her an example. But the more Karen lashed out, the more people began to push back. It started small. Dissenting voices at HOA meetings grew louder. More neighbors started ignoring petty citations, daring Karen to follow through with legal threats she didn't have the authority to make. And then there were the whispers, neighbors meeting in each other's living rooms, the undercurrent of resistance bubbling just beneath the surface. Watching all of this unfold from the sidelines was like watching a bonfire slowly build into an inferno. But I wasn't just a passive observer. My plans were well underway, and they were meticulously designed to strike at the heart of Karen's hubris. While Karen clawed to hold the very neighborhood she ruled together, I was quietly tying her up in red tape on another front. One of the most satisfying parts of dismantling Karen's empire was making her think she was still in control. To anyone looking in, I was an annoyed but passive victim, someone resigned to accepting that Willow Acres was lost. This illusion was important for what came next. I reached out to Karen through official channels, under the guise of finally wanting to negotiate. I needed her to believe I was desperate. The bait, a fabricated proposal, written up with the help of Mr. Hurley, outlining a compromise that would minimize future resistance. The document offered her everything she supposedly wanted on paper, but hidden within the carefully worded legalese were clauses that would make her life much harder down the line. For one, the agreement silently barred any contractor or HOA official from developing more than a few feet near the creek until a third-party geological survey signed off on safety. Knowing that Karen would never bother reading the fine print, I handed it off with a cordial email. Predictably, she didn't read it. She signed it within 48 hours. The beauty of this wasn't just the contract, but how satisfying it would be when Karen realized a few weeks later that her contractors were barred from going near critical areas of the site. Her own eagerness and lack of thoroughness were turning into my most effective weapons. While I waited for that to unfold, I shifted my focus to the neighborhood. Karen's overreach had brewed resentment, but resentment alone wasn't enough to spark rebellion. That push needed momentum. That's why I quietly began compiling stories. Mrs. Hargrove's hydrangea citation, Mike Addison's unceremonious firing, the absurd $500 fine issued to the Torres family for parking too many cars on their driveway during their daughter's quinceañera. Briarglen was full of these stories, and I made it my mission to gather and distribute them in the most subtle way possible. By distribute, I mean I left anonymous notes in mailboxes, complete with photocopies of Karen's ridiculous HOA actions and laminated screenshots of her snide emails to residents. No one knew where they were coming from, and that only added to their appeal. People pinned them to their refrigerators, shared them in whispers, and brought them to HOA meetings to confront her directly. One evening, I strolled into our neighborhood cafe and overheard a group of homeowners discussing the notes with an air of conspiracy. "They can't keep getting away with this," one of them muttered into their coffee cup. "It's time someone did something." I smiled to myself and tipped the barista extra for the latte. Karen may have had her clipboard and rules, but I had something she could never control: the heart of the community itself. The more she pushed, the more they'd pull away. All I needed to do now was wait. And then my first big victory came 2 weeks later. The State Environmental Commission launched their second round of inquiries into Rosewood Heights. This time, they weren't just investigating the creek. They were focusing on permitting violations tied directly to Karen's mismanagement. It wasn't entirely her fault. She hadn't personally prepared the permits. No, her contractors had cut a few corners, trying to rush things along. But Karen had signed off on every single permit, without so much as glancing at them. The commission flagged the violations as serious, slapped a warning on the project, and threatened to escalate if the issues weren't resolved immediately. Karen's reaction was predictable. From the very moment the notice reached her desk, she launched an all-out offensive to salvage Rosewood Heights. Late-night calls to her lawyers turned into daytime shouting matches with her contractors, who were more than happy to remind her that they hadn't been given clear direction on what the HOA wanted. The stress was visible now. Her perfect bob haircut looked uncharacteristically frazzled, and her smile carried the weight of weeks of sleepless nights. I'd never seen her so close to cracking. The pieces were falling into place, but the grand finish? That was still to come. Karen Colbert, once the iron-fisted ruler of Briar Glen, now resembled a general on the losing side of a hopeless war. Her perfectly curated image had begun to unravel. No longer did she stride through the neighborhood like royalty. Instead, she marched with the frenzy of someone trying to salvage a sinking ship. The Environmental Commission's warnings had thrown her into a panic, but even that paled in comparison to the rebellion brewing within her own ranks. Helen's quiet resignation from the HOA board was just the beginning. Weeks later, 2 more key members followed, claiming the stress was becoming untenable. But everyone knew the truth. They were fleeing before Karen brought the entire operation crashing down on all their heads. Karen's desperation became plain for all to see when she scheduled a rushed emergency meeting. Flyers were slipped under every door demanding mandatory attendance, printed in bold, angry capital letters. The meeting was held at the community center, but when Karen stepped up to the podium, the air in the room was thick with frustration and resentment. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, her voice lacking the usual veneer of control. "There are rumors circulating about Rosewood Heights. Allegations, lies. I'm here to assure you that progress is being made, and this slight inconvenience with the environmental regulators is temporary. We are on track to deliver the most prestigious development this neighborhood has ever seen." The crowd was unmoved. Whispers darted around the room like fireflies, the hum of discontent growing louder with every empty reassurance Karen tried to offer. She pulled out a stack of glossy architectural renderings and began flipping through them, as if a visual appeal would somehow distract the crowd from the growing pile of unanswered questions. "Questions?" she asked, her voice clipped and stern, daring anyone to challenge her. A hand shot up in the middle of the room. It belonged to none other than Mrs. Hargrove, holding a small notepad and wearing her battle-hardened hydrangea pruning gloves, as if standing her ground against Karen's tyranny had become her full-time job. "Yes, Mrs. Hargrove," Karen asked, a thin layer of derision in her tone. Mrs. Hargrove cleared her throat and adjusted her reading glasses. "Will this prestigious development, as you call it, come out of our HOA fees when it inevitably fails?" The crowd erupted into chuckles and scattered applause. Karen's face twisted, attempting to recover from the blow. I don't know what you mean by fails," Karen snapped, though the strain in her voice betrayed her growing dread. Rosewood Heights is not going to fail. A man in a plaid shirt near the back of the room stood up, raising his voice over the murmurs. You said the same thing about the new road project, and last I checked, we're still dodging potholes big enough to swallow a bicycle. That was all it took. The crowd turned on her like a tide, residents raising questions and complaints faster than Karen could bat them down. Violations, fees, construction delays, broken promises, skyrocketing dues. Each new topic was like driving another nail into Karen's perfectly curated armor. For the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. She didn't have answers. The community was finally speaking out, and Karen was drowning under the surge. And I leaned quietly against the far wall, savoring every second. Watching Karen's empire crumble was a special kind of thrill, and I knew this meeting would only be the start of the chaos to come. By July, Rosewood Heights was on its last legs, though Karen refused to acknowledge it. She spent her days stomping up and down Willow Acres, barking orders at contractors who could barely conceal their contempt for her. With every passing week, more and more equipment was pulled from the site, and the skeletons of unfinished homes stood like gravestones marking her failing dreams. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She became combative, reaching out to every connection in her network to try and force progress. She called in favors from city council members, wrote scathing letters to the Environmental Commission, and even hired a PR firm to manage her image and spin her failures into temporary setbacks. But none of it worked. The resistance from her own neighborhood was too strong. The violations against Rosewood Heights too blatant to ignore. And the biggest blow was yet to come. I had been saving my final move for just the right moment, waiting for the point when Karen was spread thinner than overcooked gravy. That moment arrived late one Friday afternoon, when I filed a formal petition with the local zoning board. The petition, armed with airtight evidence from Hurley's research, declared the entirety of the Rosewood Heights project in violation of not one, but 3 critical zoning regulations. The buffer zones around the creek? Violated. The easements protecting the old oak trees? Completely ignored. And the specific clause requiring community input for projects affecting more than 10 acres? Never addressed. I filed the petition anonymously, of course, though deep inside I hoped Karen would discover who had pulled the trigger. It only seemed fair she knew exactly against whom she had underestimated so severely. The zoning board didn't waste time. Within days, a cease and desist order was issued, halting all activity at Rosewood Heights indefinitely. Construction crews abandoned their machines on site as regulators showed up with clipboards and cameras, documenting every infraction Karen had tried to sweep under the rug. When the notice was delivered to her door, Karen reportedly spent the evening furiously dialing numbers on her phone, demanding answers from an increasingly dwindling circle of allies. But even her most loyal supporters were starting to jump ship. There was no saving Rosewood Heights now, and Karen's kingdom was sliding out from under her faster than she could scramble to hold it together. The next few weeks were a storm of legal proceedings, government inquiries, and heartbroken would-be buyers demanding refunds. Karen held one final town meeting in a desperate bid to rally support, only to be met with a fraction of the usual attendance. Those who did show up came not to support her, but to demand answers she no longer had the power to give. By the end of the month, Karen had stepped down as HOA president, her resignation letter quietly circulated by email. She claimed it was for health reasons, but the truth was glaringly obvious. Her reign was over, her project was dead, and all she had left was her name, stained forever as a cautionary tale in the annals of Briar Glen. And Willow Acres. It stood as it always had, the oak swaying gently in victory, the creek bubbling with the life Karen had thoughtlessly threatened. I spent an evening walking the land, my boots kicking softly through the grass as I felt the satisfaction of a fight well fought. The land was mine, just as my granddad intended, and the stories it now held, They were sweeter than anything I could have imagined.